I'm always a bit surprised when I'm introduced as a conservative person, because I've been a very militant feminist all my life. I've been always a champion of equal rights and against any kind of discrimination, whether it's on origin, color of the skin, or whatever. And I've stayed on those principles. But as a well-known professor of the university, the VUB, says Mr. Elgardus, he says, well, I have not moved on my principle, it's society which has moved. And so defending certain values now has suddenly become suspect because it might show lack of respect for other cultures. So I would like to begin with, I have a definition already with the word monoculture. I understand it for agriculture, but not for what is called high culture. I will come to that. But I would like to start with an island, the Chatham Islands, very far away from here, 500 miles east of New Zealand, where a people called the Moriori, whom maybe you don't know, had lived peacefully for centuries and centuries. And then another Polynesian people, the Maori, came and invaded them with clubs, with weapons, and said, well, from now on, we are the boss here and you are our slaves. Now, the Moriori could have fought the Maori because they were more numerous, but they had a tradition of resolving problems by negotiation, by mediation, and not by violence. So they said, well, we'll talk to them and see how we can share our island. The Maori simply didn't listen and killed, over the years, killed the whole population in a horrible way. Those poor Moriori people lived in really in terror for their lives, hid under the ground, and at the end, men, women, children were killed. Why do I tell this? Well, now in New Zealand, when I see the Maori, who are a minority and who feel that they have been robbed of their culture or expressed, when they ask for respect for their culture, I wonder if they also include in that culture this episode of a relatively recent past of 1835. Well, at least there is a chronicle of one of the leaders of that invasion who said, we took possession in accordance with our custom, we caught all the people, and he goes on to say that they killed them all, but he said, what the hell, it was in accordance with our custom. I thought, well, at least in 1835 they didn't say it was my culture. Bon. And this brings me, because it's very important to me, to the extremely loose, sloppy, ambiguous way the term of culture is being used in public debate. And as a woman, I'm particularly sensitive to it and alarmed with it. And I will again speak from my experience. I go back to the beginning of the 90s, and then I was the president of the International Federation of Journalists, which is a worldwide federation of unions of journalists who, of course, defend press freedom and decent working conditions for journalists. In May 1991, I was in Windhoek, capital of Namibia, on a UNESCO-organized seminar for African newspaper publishers and editors. And this was a momentous seminar because there those African publishers and editors said publicly in a statement in which I had a very small part of drafting towards their dictatorships or all their regimes, that press freedom is not an obstacle to, but a condition for development and progress. And later the UN has made this date, that was May the 3rd, has made this a day of the International Press Freedom Day. Now, at that same place, I met one of my South African colleagues, a black, very radical South African journalist. We were at the end of apartheid. And he knew that there was a congress of the IFJ where he would come to 2 months later, where I was a candidate for re-election. And he said, Mia, I'd never have a woman for president because that's against my culture, but I will vote for you in the IFJ. So I answered rather dryly, thank you very much, Tami, but in the meantime, I hope you change your culture. Now, there was a German male journalist belonging to a left-wing union, the Deutsche Journalistenunion, who heard this and said, Mia, how dare you tell that man that he has to change his culture? And I said, listen, what is this? We are here to celebrate also the end of apartheid, South Africa becoming a democratic, egalitarian society. And this black colleague tells me that in his South Africa, women should be second-class citizens. Do you call this culture? And I mean, what is this about? And I thought that extremely insulting to women. Another instance, more than once I have heard that in working against female genital mutilation in Africa, we have to act carefully because it's a cultural tradition. Well, taking unsuspicious little girls to a hut where their little legs will be held apart and then their genital organs brutally cut out without any form of anesthesia, frankly, to me that sounds like a barbaric custom and not to culture. Another instance in India, Hindu custom demanded for 1,000 years that the widow should throw herself on the funeral pyre of her husband, of her dead husband. Well, the British Raj banned this custom in 1827. And the British Army's Commander-in-Chief, Charles Napier, is noted to have said when he had to confront local opposition against this, in one instance he replied, okay, you say that it's your custom to burn widows, very well, but we also have a custom, men who burn women alive, well, we put a rope around their neck and we hang them. Okay, so you build your funeral pyre, and my carpenters will build a gallows next to it. You follow your custom and we will follow ours. Now, is this arrogance? Is this intolerance towards another culture? As a woman, I would say that is more like a step towards enlightenment. I could have many other instances, but I will not. But I will say that I'm constantly shocked, and I hope most women are or become more aware of this, that the killing, the maiming, the discriminating of women is dignified with a nice term, culture. I've never heard that word used in connection with discrimination of men. I've never heard anybody say, well, you should understand in South Africa, it's not part of the culture of those white people to have a black person living next to them. No, that's racism, point c'est tout, and it had to be combated. I have never heard this word, and I hope never to hear to have it applied to slavery. So that's why, I mean, I think this is very important because I think it's extremely insulting to women that customs which are degrading to women, which maim them, which kill them, or branded culture, which you would never do with racism or that kind of thing. And so I go to two, there are many definitions of culture, and they have been given, but I go to two, which I culled from the Encyclopedia Britannica and other sources. The first is the arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement. And that is culture in the positive sense. Nature is immutable. Tigers and bees and ants, as far as they still exist, live like they lived 1,000 years ago. Culture, on the other hand, is basically change and has been since the dawn of human history a fantastic adventure of change, a progress in philosophical thought, in science, in the art, in all kinds of things which have made human life so much more agreeable, diverse, exciting, sometimes dangerous. But in that sense, culture has a positive connotation. And it has, in the whole of Eurasia, just to look at that large continent, it has never been monoculture. It is synonymous with cultural fertilization, cross-fertilizations throughout the centuries. So in that sense, talking about culture as monoculture. No, of course, there are different expressions to it. Indian art is not the same as Italian art, but that doesn't mean that Indian art is monocultural or Italian art is monocultural. They are very diverse amongst themselves, and they are a result of millennia of cross-fertilization across this enormous continent. Just, I'm not saying that that's not true for others, but I keep to Eurasia because I know this best. So, when the conveners of for this debate speak of culture as the homogeneous expression of culture of a single social or ethnic group, they apply another definition of culture, not the high culture, as I will call it, but simply a descriptive thing, that of culture as and I give the definition I called, the ideas, customs, and social behavior of a particular people of society. In that sense, culture is a value-free and a descriptive term. It's simply saying, okay, this is the way this society and this society and this society live. These are their customs, their law, etc. And so, and now, in that sense, I cannot but disagree with one of the paragraphs of the text which we were sent, where it said across Europe and much of the globe, societies are understood through adhering to homogeneous racial, cultural, or ideological parameters, that those societies which are rather homogeneous have entered the mainstream. And I thought, well, this is contrary to what history is about. The mainstream has been that people within a given society obey common rules and laws. They could be imposed by a dictatorship, and they had a kind of homogeneous way of living to make sure that within a given society, people would live with a minimum level of violence and in cohesion. And so that has been the mainstream. And again, okay, as a woman, and women are human beings too, but I'm more sharply aware of that. My colleagues could always travel all over the world with the clothes they wear at home. Well, I have needed a special wardrobe for traveling in a large part of the Muslim world, because it was like that. I also needed to forget my usual way of life, to conform to a rather monocultural set of norms in many countries. Especially as a younger woman, I could not simply go out at night as I can do in Brussels and look for a nice place to eat or to sit on the sidewalk and have a drink. I do not know how many nights I've spent in my hotel room with a club sandwich and a Coke. It is like that. To the far east of Asia, I like Tokyo very much, which is extremely vibrant city and cultural life and its security. But in that city of 10 million people, you do not see a lot of ethnic diversity. It's very, very mono-ethnic, but it's at the same time it's very vibrant, and it's open to cultural influences from elsewhere. China, Vietnam, and other Asian countries too do not look very diverse and seem to live by a rather homogeneous set of norms. So I would say that the mainstream was not a celebration of diversity. The mainstream was having a society where a set of norms were applied to everybody. It could be multi-ethnic or not, but rather homogeneous. And that is a historical fact, and it's a very understandable one. If we can go shortly back about 8,000, 9,000 years, a momentous change for the whole of humanity took place when gradually, groups of humans stopped being hunters-gatherers and became farmers. They settled down. Settled farming populations are much more numerous. A traditional group of hunter-gatherers is something between 50 and 150 people maximum. Okay, if you have a settled sedentary society, you have a much larger density of population. So that meant you also needed an organization, which hunter-gatherers do not need. I mean, they agree amongst themselves who is going to do what. But in a more complex society, you need an authority to organize, for instance, storage and distribution of food, maintain roads, apportion access to water and land, develop norms and rules, including religious ones, in order to maintain a form of harmony in a large and complex society. And so it was important to create a feeling of group feeling and living according to the same rules, to create in-group solidarity, which, that has been going on. The other side of creating this in-group solidarity, which is not evident in very large societies, was of course that it created at the same time distrust or aggressivity against other groups. And that is what has been going on in the world until now. Internal cohesion versus enmity, or at least competition with other groups. Now, but anyway, the birthplace of the state, as we see it, as there's so many inventions that have benefited humanity, is the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia. And so the states that have developed in very different forms since then were, by definition, monocultural, in the sense there was one set of laws and rules of behavior which were applicable to everybody. In multi-ethnic states, like for instance the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, those norms had to be imposed by an autocratic regime, because apparently that seems to be human nature, that it's very difficult to develop a kind of identification with people with other languages, other religious belief, etc. So with the arrival of democratic ideas of government by the people, those empires fell apart. One should not forget that in the 19th century, go back and read it, liberalism and nationalism were considered as completely complementary, because it was said that once you have a society where the citizens decide on who is going to govern them and under what law, you need a minimum of homogeneity to realize that. And for instance, in La Révolution des Peuples in 1848, when revolution swept Europe, the German chant was Einigkeit und Recht und Freiheit, unity for the German people, law and freedom. So who can oppose that? That was their idea of having a state like that. So to summarize, culture in the sense of the rules that people live by in a society, to have a minimum level of violence and a maximum of peaceful living together, that has been the mainstream. It's rather Western Europe which has left the mainstream in several aspects, since what is more or less, grosso modo, called 68, there has been a reaction against the old societies, and suddenly I was a teacher of Latin and Greek for 2 years in those momentous years before I became a journalist. And suddenly in schools, discipline was, that was crushing the soul of the children, and social norms and etiquette was like a kind of fascism. And many of you are much too young to have known Amsterdam in the 80s, but I can tell you it was more of a jungle than of a civilized city. I remember going there to the old Kras, the Krasnapolski Hotel with my husband, and we said, oh, this is a miracle. So many parking places next to the hotel, fantastic. So we go in, and the receptionist asks, have you found the entrance to our garage? And we said, no, we found a parking place. And he said, okay, if you want to find your car again tomorrow, and without it being ready for the junk, you'd better put it inside. So already there was a loosening of this idea, okay, if we want to live peacefully together, we have to adhere to a certain set of norms. And then on top of that, you get more and more immigration from other cultures, so from other traditions, from other customs. And so I can already imagine and understand that they ask themselves, what are we supposed to integrate in? What are the norms of society? And so the Europeans have been extremely lax internally towards their own people and towards newcomers, thinking, well, okay, everything will just be all right. Well, it has not been all right. And so if you look at our societies today, without a clear set of norms and without a sense of citizenship, of adhering freely to those norms, you get more friction, more violence, more chaos, more instability. Our democracies today, show a lot of political instability. Look at Spain, where they had to do elections twice. Look at this country. Look at the Netherlands or Germany, where it's very difficult to form coalitions. So it's not such a good evolution. So asking that your own your old population should conform to the norm and that newly arrived people should conform to them, that's not the lack of respect of culture, and one muddles the debate again if one does not distinguish between culture as the set of rules one lives by and as culture in the nobler sense of the fantastic creativity of humanity. And for instance, okay, people live under different customs. Our countries have evolved into a democracy because we think that morally, yes, this is a better system of freedom, of equality, of non-discrimination between men and women, between people on the basis of the color or the skin, the origin, the social origin, or whatever, is a better system than dictatorship, and apparently it attracts a lot of people. So in that sense, for instance, we have child benefit. If someone in Belgium comes and claims benefit for 15 children by 4 wives, and you say you cannot have it, that is not lack of respect for culture. It's simply applying the laws and the values which you have in your country. And so we should not drag culture into it and say, well, we should be a multicultural society. No, it's simply a set of values you have, and that's the way you have a society, again, which lives without too much friction. And if you do not have that, again, then you get more friction, you get more criminality, you get more political instability. So that was what I wanted to make very clear. One thing is culture in the set of the rules people live by, and that is, I would not call that monocultural, simply that you cannot live in one country with different sets of laws. It is like that. And the question is, how have those laws been involved? And if one thinks that they are unjust, well, then you get a movement started and you get the political work to have them change via democratic means. I now come to my other definition of culture, the manifestation of intelligence, thus the culture that has freed us from the immutable tyranny of nature, and which has given us clothes and houses and air travel and culture and all kinds of things. And yes, okay, I mentioned air travel because I'm not going to knuckle down for the people who say that you are guilty of a terrible sin if you still take an airplane. Now, where does our culture in the higher sense come from? Well, again, Europe is a newcomer, is a very newcomer in the old cultural scene. Someone who lived from 8,000 before Christ until 1,000 of our era, if you had asked a very wise person, a very perspicacious, which cultures, in the really cultures, and he saw developing and had the biggest future, he would name 3, I think, all 3 on the Asian continent. Well, Europe, Asia, the Asian Mediterranean region, the Fertile Crescent between the 2 rivers, and then further on Asia, in Asia. And China, and of course China, which was at the top at a certain moment of evolution. So because farming, animal domestication, the alphabet, the wheel, I don't know how many inventions, the state, they all came to Europe from the Fertile Crescent. So again, talking about monoculture, if you speak about high culture, it's a nonsense because it's always been influenced by others and then developed in their own ways. And even from 1000 to 1450, the flow of science and technology was still mainly from east to west, so into Europe from mainly Islamic societies, which stretched from India to North Africa. And during the same centuries, China led the world in technology. So how did then what is called the European miracles suddenly happen? Well, I'm not going to speculate or philosophy on the spark, but which something has ignited indeed from the 16th century on, a chain reaction without precedent in the history of a chain reaction of invention in every sphere of human intellect and creativity. And that has led to expansion, like I mean, all vital cultures have always expanded. Alexander the Great has gone and conquered part of the world. The Romans have done it. The Islam has done it. They are maybe the most successful imperialists of all times, starting from their small sandy peninsula. And so the Europeans too, well, started to explore the world. And I mean, the big question is, for instance, look at China in the beginning, in the years from 1410 to 1438, 5 large fleets left China for enormous voyages of exploration and bringing back all kind of valuable things, which went across the Indian Ocean to East Africa. They had large ships. I mean, the 3 ships of Christopher Columbus were puny little things compared to those ships. They had hundreds of ships. They had 28,000 people crew sometimes on all those fleets. They came back with all kind of treasure. When then suddenly you had the Palace Revolution, a new emperor who said, okay, this is finished. We have all we need within China. So all those artifacts, all those treasures were stored somewhere. The ships were left to rot, the shipyards were killed. And so, okay, I mean, it could have been China which rounded the Cape of Good Hope and came to the west. That didn't happen. So one of the advantages for Europe, and there we come again to the system of internal cohesion and rivalry wars with external group, but Europe's chance has been at that time its political fragmentation. Columbus, for instance, went to 3 different kings and princes with his idea of starting on this discovery to the west. And ultimately it was Queen Isabella of Castile who gave him the money to do it. Later, when Galileo Galilei was imprisoned in Italy because his theories were considered to be heretical, well, some people smuggled his papers towards Amsterdam and Edinburgh, which were 2 centers of enlightened thought, and they were published. So our fragmentation has also been an advantage. So now, to come back, okay, and so also this fragmentation of royal courts meant you had lots of patrons of the arts, princes and bishops and kings, and courts were centers of artistic creativity for composers, painters and artists who went from one place to the other and learned from each other. And so this has created a very, very rich high culture. Now, you cannot blame Europeans for being attached to that cultural heritage, but being attached to that does not mean that Europe isn't open for other influences. Again, you had the influence in the beginning of the 20th century of what was called l'art nègre, African art. You had influence of jazz music, which was influenced by the music of black slaves in America. You had different influences, but is there a certain crispation now? Yes. And I started to wonder why. And I found an answer when I was reflecting, for instance, on North American Indians, why they would want to live in reservations in the way of their ancestors. I would never want to go back to the way people lived in the time of Ambiorix or even Jan van Eyck. I like my own century. So why would they want that? And then suddenly I understood I'm very secure in this culture because it developed incrementally, organically within this continent. But Indians, like other ethnic groups who were conquered, felt robbed of their culture. And of course, they want to go back and to find those roots back. It's totally normal. And now, and that is really, I mean, this is not a political statement, it is a statement of fact, and we should be very careful about it. Europeans now have a feeling that they might be being robbed of their own culture. Suddenly they hear that Shakespeare and Mozart or others, well, they were all wrong because they are all white men. Suddenly you hear it say that you cannot stage Shakespeare anymore like it was because he was a racist, because he was a sexist. Well, of course. I mean, as that famous sentence in the famous first sentence of the Go-Between says, the past is another country, they do things differently there. Everybody was racist, sexist, what we call now in those days. And so suddenly you see people I mean, tampering with Shakespeare and Mozart and all kind of geniuses to make them acceptable for these multicultural times. And frankly, I must give the usual disclaimer, I'm not an old fogey, I am a consumer of all kinds of cultural manifestations, but I do not see why I should not enjoy the glorious beauty of Mozart's operas or Shakespeare's plays as they were written. I mean, all those people who want to tamper with them, I think, will write something glorious and new, which is, I mean, addresses itself to this time. And so there is this feeling, and especially, which I think is very dangerous, is saying, okay, they were all white people. Yeah, well, they were Europeans. I mean, I'm not going to blame Africans because they were black people, artists in Africa. And what I think very dangerous is that now culture is being judged by the color of the skin, which is totally contrary to everything a democracy stands for and high culture stands for. And when I hear society being divided between white people and people of color, I think, what is this? There are white people who are, I mean, extremely good and noble people, and there are people of color who can be criminals and wife beaters and whatever. I mean, you cannot, I think it's a very dangerous debate. And it gives, let us say, indigenous Europeans the feeling that, okay, by opening our doors for immigration, I mean, we get slapped in the face and we are being told that our continent is not our continent. And that is a feeling one should understand. It's not monoculture, it's being attached to your own culture. It doesn't prevent being open to others. You see the artistic creativity in Brussels, of Antwerp, they are open. But I mean, it's a very serious warning to be careful with the way you use culture, because if you do not discuss this in a serene, democratic way, you are laying a boulevard for what we call the populists. Look at the election results everywhere. It's not that Europeans suddenly have all become, I mean, fascist or semi-fascist or racist or monocultural. It's simply that with this grievance culture and with this, I mean, this totally wrong appropriation of the term culture on color of the skin and dividing cultures by origin of color of the skin, white people and people of color. I mean, we are wrong, this is not culture. And so I would say if we see culture as the set of rules people live in, okay, it is a kind of monoculture because you have one law for everybody. If you look at high culture, the term makes no sense at all because there have been a hybridization through the centuries of culture. And then they have their own manifestation, but please talk about it in cultural sense, because if the color of the skin of origin is stuck onto that, we start on a totally, I mean, really dangerous way. And again, I cannot say it enough, we open a boulevard for the false prophets of so-called real culture. Thank you very much.